Hey folks, and welcome to the channel and another GPU test. The GTX 900 series cards have been wildly popular for Nvidia. Despite being about 2.5 years old, these Maxwell cards are still very popular, and it's reflected in the most recent Steam hardware survey. At the time of recording, the GTX 960 and 970, those two cards hold over 10% of the GPU market between them. I mean, this can be great for anyone looking to buy an older piece of hardware, as the more of them that there are out there, the better the chances are of picking up a bit of a bargain. Enter my own GTX 960 from ZOTAC. This was picked up on eBay for £65 after a £10 eBay voucher. So this GPU offers a bit of an unusual proposition. From the specs, I don't really expect this to be able to compete with my GTX 1050 Ti or the R9 280X, but at half the price of even my bargain basement 1050 Ti and 20% less than the average price of the AMD card, this GTX 960, it seems like it could start to make some sense for the budget conscious gamers out there. After all, it's only one generation old, and it is the card that the 1050 Ti replaced, so we're going to be putting it up against the 1050 Ti in a few choice games, old and new, and see what the outcome is. So the GTX 1050 Ti has already been covered on this channel in quite a bit of depth, but here's just a quick recap of the specs. It's a Gigabyte GTX 1050 Ti, 4GB of GDDR5 RAM, 128-bit memory bus, 768 shaders, 32 ROPs, and a decent boost in clock speeds on both the core and the VRAM, and I was able to pick this card up at the start of 2017 for £130 new. The GTX 960, it comes in two variants, a 2GB and a 4GB, both on the same 128-bit bus as the 1050 Ti. It's got slightly more shader units at 1024, but they're still the same 32 ROPs. Clock speeds are slightly slower than the 1050 Ti on the core, but the VRAM clock speeds are roughly the same. Unlike the 1050 Ti, the 960 does require one 6-pin PCIe power connector, and you could probably expect to pay around £75 there or thereabouts for the GTX 960 today. So we're going to be testing all the games today at a resolution of 1920 by 1080 on the Core i5 4590 test rig, coupled with 8GB of DDR3 RAM. So let's see how these two cards compare at the start of 2017. So first up, we're going to use the built-in benchmark on the latest Hitman game. We're going to run everything on a high level of detail with FX88 turned on and 16 times anisotropic filtering. We have had to bump the quality of the textures down slightly to fit in with my 960's 2GB frame buffer, but if you bought yourself a 4GB, you could quite happily crank that setting up. Now this is a benchmark that has been known to quite heavily favour AMD cards, but since we're testing two Nvidia cards, we can level the playing field a little bit. The GTX 960 returns a very respectable 58 FPS, with the 1050 Ti pulling ahead at 66 FPS. Crysis 3 again showed a little bit of disparity between the two, and the 960 returned an average here of 58 FPS. This was on the high preset with 2 times SMAA and 16 times anisotropic filtering, while the GTX 1050 Ti, it returned a 5 FPS higher at 63 FPS, and the frame rates for both cards never dipped below 44. Cry Primal was run on the highest preset with the HD texture pack that I've covered in the video up in the corner turned off, and the results were very similar for both cards. The GTX 960 returned an average frame rate of 54 FPS with a minimum of 47, and the 1050 Ti returned a slightly lower average at 52 but a slightly higher minimum at 48. Next up, we tested the open world of GTA 5 with all settings bar 2 set to high, and those settings were the shader and shadows, which were set to normal. And I guess the difference between the cards was fairly similar to what we've just seen. The GTX 960 returned an average frame rate of 79 but a minimum of 55. The GTX 1050 Ti, it returned a higher minimum frame rate at 61 FPS but a slightly lower average frame rate at 77. We've seen the GTX 1050 Ti pull ahead of the 960 in Skyrim Special Edition. Running in the ultra quality, the 960 returned an average frame rate of 56 FPS with minimums of 48. The 1050 Ti in this test, it returned a steady average of 60 FPS but with a minimum frame rate higher than the 960 at 54. Finally, we tested Battlefield 1, the 1080p and the Ultra preset, and run through one of the chapters. Both the 960 and the 1050 Ti slightly dipped below 60 FPS on average, but there was a 9 FPS difference between the 960 and the 1050 Ti when it came to the minimum frame rates that were seen. So, any recommendations on this card? Well, there's definitely a case to be made for the GTX 960, especially if you can get a good deal on a 4GB model. On average, it's going to offer around about 90% performance of the GTX 1050 Ti, but at around 60% of the price, all while running on a much more modest PSU than the likes of my stalwart R9 280X will require. So if you want your money to go a long way and you cannot push that budget any further, it could still well be worth a look. But one thing's for sure though, if you're looking for performance in this ballpark, there's so many cards out there for you to choose from, and it is not difficult and it's not expensive to be able to buy and build a nice 1080p gaming rig, regardless of your budget. So with that said folks, thanks for watching this video. Be sure to tell me what you thought of it down below, and if you think the Maxwell GPU architecture's popularity was justified. Remember to use those thumbs to help me bring you the kind of content you guys want to see, and consider subscribing to the channel. All that's left for me to say is a big thank you for those of you who have already subbed. We're past the 600 mark the last week, and I never even thought I'd get 600 views on a video, never mind subscribers to the channel. So I've got to put out a very big thank you to everyone who's subscribed, and I'll see you all very soon in the next video.